Yesterday morning at 10:30 a.m., combined forces of the Arkansas State Police, the FBI, and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms arrested James Ellison, age 48, on one of the 3 compounds owned by the Covenant Sword and Arm of the Lord, otherwise known as the CSA.
Kerry Noble, thanks so much for coming on to Talk Beliefs from your home in Texas. You are the author of Tabernacle of Hate and Tabernacle of Hope, books that outline your time in and healing from your days as a member of a far-right militant Christian organization, the Covenant, the Sword, and the Arm of the Lord. So how are you doing today, Kerry? You had some pretty strange weather in Texas lately. Did you see any of that snow and ice?
Yeah, unfortunately, we had 5 days, I think it was, of snow and ice. Our power, fortunately, did not go off at our house, but I had busted water pipes, so that was bad enough.
Well, it's quite a story you have to tell, so let's jump right in. It all begins in the late 70s when you and your wife decided to move from Texas to Arkansas. So tell us about that.
Originally, my wife and I did move up there. We went to visit the first time around. My wife was pregnant with our second child. We'd had some friends that moved up there a year before that lived with us in Dallas. It was a quiet, rural, peaceful church in those days. It was known as Zarephath Horeb Community Church. So we wanted to go up there, visit our friends, have our baby, have a little vacation time, and then we planned to go back to Texas to finish Bible school. Both of us were going to Bible school at that time. And we just ended up falling in love with the place and decided to move there. It was extremely peaceful in those days. It was an apocalyptic group. Now, the founder of the group started as a refuge for people who could come out when they came out of the cities during whatever time would happen in the future. We'd be able to house them, feed them, clothe them, that kind of stuff. So we did believe in a future second coming of Christ. We weren't setting dates at all at that time, and we were just kind of waiting. We didn't even know what scenario to expect, but we did believe that Christians were going to go through what was known as the tribulation time, and not be raptured out ahead of time like most churches teach. So it was interesting that first year.
And you call this compound the farm, as you mentioned, isn't it?
Yeah, it's sort of, most of the time we call it farm. Sometimes because the media would call it the compound, because that was kind of started by the media. And very seldom did you ever say, "I'm going back to CSA." That's what everybody else on the outside called us. We just called it the farm or the compound. Primarily the compound, because we had what we called settlements. We had 3 different settlements on the property. Compound is what we call the first or main settlement, because it had the water, running water, electricity, where the other 2 didn't.
It is our duty as Christians and Americans to learn how to survive. To learn how to survive what's coming on the earth, so we can better serve God's people for His name's sake.
After quite a peaceful first year within this community, things began to change quite radically. And this was after you got hold of a particular cassette tape, isn't that right?
Yeah, like I said, the first year was great. The guys cut timber in the cedar woods. We had we had a contract to clear 5,000 acres. And then in August of 1978, I got a hold of a cassette tape from a friend by a man named John Todd, who was going around to a lot of churches in those days, teaching people about terms we had never heard of. The Illuminati, the Bilderbergers, Council of 13, Council of Foreign Relations, things like that. And he was going around not just talking about these organizations, but naming names of who was involved with them and how they were infiltrating the Christian churches, the political offices, the music industry, film industry, everybody. I mean, he just named names right and left that were supposedly part of these organizations to help overthrow the government and form a one world government, a one world religion. And that was all extremely new to us, but it kind of helped us to understand kind of what was going on in the country that we were concerned about, and it built upon our end time scenario anyway. So, we listened to him. But the one thing that he said that was extremely significant to us was, he said, what you're doing in terms of refugees, and that is good, but when the good people come out of the towns and cities that you're going to take care of, what are you going to do when the bad people come? How will you protect yourselves? And that honestly was not something that we had thought about or considered before. We just assumed God would take care of us. But he said, you got to have guns. So that sort of made sense to us. We talked about it, decided that, yes, we should do that. So we spent $52,000 over the next 18 months on guns, ammunition, and military equipment. Before that, one guy had a single shot 22. Was it. That's all anybody had in those days. It was just him. So obviously we increased by a tremendous amount. Started training. If you're going to have guns, you need to know how to use them. Every man had a pistol, a rifle. We built a obstacle course, built a shooting range, and built a 4-block mock town called Silhouette City training. And we trained very often, very well. Eventually became known as the #1 civilian SWAT team in the United States. So now we were a survivalist and a paramilitary unit, and got to be pretty well known with that.
This is the closest thing to a rod of iron that we've got today.
Amen.
And this rod of iron that's predicted in the scripture is pictorial, or it pictures force, because God will cause his man-child overcomer to rule with force.
And it was thanks to another cassette tape that your group eventually took on some new views about race.
Yeah, in the fall of, it'll be 1979, the leader of our group, Jim Ellison, in order to earn some extra money for the group, went to Missouri to work on missile silos in those days. He was a welder by trade. So he went up there. While he was up there, he met a man named Dan Gaiman, who had what was called the Church of Israel. So one day, over the weekend, Jim came home and got the elders together and had us listen to this cassette tape. And it was a church service that started out with patriotic songs. My Country 'Tis of Thee, America the Beautiful, and a few regular church songs. And then Gaiman got up and started preaching a message that we were not familiar with. And it was what he called Christian identity, of that the white race was the true Israel of God and not the Jews. Talked about a 2 seed line theology known as Christian identity, that the Jews came from sexual relations of Eve with the devil in the Garden of Eden. Cain and Abel were really twins, and ever since that day there had been this warfare between God's people and the children of the devil going on. This obviously was foreign to anything we'd ever been taught before. We looked at it. What sort of opened the door for us was, one, they did it on a patriotic level, but here was someone who wanted to talk about race in the scriptures. Where Ellison and I grew up, race was kind of a taboo subject in the churches. So this made us inquisitive. I bought a bunch of books, since everything came through me as the Bible teacher. We studied it, we looked at it, and eventually, after about 6 months, we adapted that into our own theology. We became known as a racist organization, as well as survivalist and paramilitary.
Well, the outlook of the group altered even further in 1982 after, of all things, the introduction of polygamy.
Yeah. By 1982, we were getting pretty well known. So we decided to have what we call a national convocation in October 82. And we invited Aryan nations, a lot of clan groups, posse comitatus, just everybody that was involved in the movement, any kind of leadership roles. We invited everybody. Had about 300 people showed up for the convocation, for a week-long convocation. It was successful. They got to know us. We got to know them a lot better.
Mm-hmm.
After that was over with, Jim called all the elders together and said that God had told him he was to take a second wife. Now, this was something that was taboo in the group. We had decided back in 1978, when the subject first came up, it was not going to happen with us. We knew groups who did it. We knew individuals that had more than one wife. And it just didn't seem like something that would fit in with us. So, we just tabled it and said, nobody's going to do it. So all of a sudden, Jim says the Lord told him to do it. And that caused a huge ruckus amongst the elders.
I can imagine.
So what basically happened, even though Jim said that he would not do it unless all the elders agreed, he did it anyway. And so we had a major split in the group. We lost to about 2/3 of our members. At that point, we were 150 men, women, children, about 32 families, number of single people. We lost 2/3, lost about 100 members altogether. So that was like going through a major divorce for us. The ones that we lost were primarily the paramilitary people, the ones who cared more about the guns than anything else. So they left, and the ones that were left were the more spiritually minded ones. We wanted to stay and saw this kind of a sign as going back to our more spiritual roots at that point.
And you still kept in with the racist things, though, didn't you, though?
Yeah, we still did at that point. We didn't really emphasize it that much. Right after, the split, like I said, we were primarily just trying to concentrate on the spiritual aspect, even though the racist aspect was still there.
Well, in the following couple of years, the group concentrated more and more on perpetrating violence as a way of getting its points across. And that is what eventually led to your crisis of conscience. So take us through that journey.
What happened after the split? We tried to just go back to our roots. And that was successful for a while. And then in the summer of 83, but actually spring of 83, just shortly after we had our split, a man named Gordon Call, who was a tax protester we'd never heard of before, had a shootout with some U.S. Marshals up in the Dakotas and killed a couple of Marshals. His son got arrested. Call fled, went underground, and was discovered in June down in Arkansas, not too far from our group. He ended up with a shootout with FBI agents, local police, and the sheriff from the county got killed, and Gordon Call got killed also. Shortly after that happened, the right wing wanted to know what we were going to do about it, because that was considered our backyard. We hadn't planned on doing anything about it, because, like I said, we never even heard of Gordon Call ahead of time. But we had to make a decision. Are we going to not do anything and lose face with the right wing, or are we going to be forced to do something in order to save face? So we talked about it. Some friends of ours had gotten in trouble or gotten arrested for harboring Call. Every July, Aryan nations held up their Congress, they called it. So it was decided that Jim and his wife should go up there and visit in that area, visit the conference, see what was going on. So Jim went up there. That's where he met a lot of other leaders again. They decided it was time to go to war against the United States government. So Jim came back all excited that this is what we're going to do. They talked about plans of counterfeiting money, robbing armored cars, and that kind of stuff. So we found out that some of our former members that had left the group joined with some former members from Aryan nations and formed what was known as the Order. They were a more extremist group than us, did several armored car robberies of millions of dollars, and they killed a Jewish talk show host, Alan Berg. So they were very serious. And of course, it was getting a lot of media attention. So we had decided that in order for us to do something, we initially planned to attack the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City, the same one that Tim LaVey did 10 years later. And we were going to use rocket launchers built with 9 to 12 rockets, bolted in the back of a van. We'd pull up, aim them towards the building, and launch all the rockets. Jim and another man who was sort of a quasi member of ours, Richard Wayne Snell, went down, cased the building. Of course, in those days, there was no security hardly whatsoever. Talked about how easy it would be. And while the munitions man was building the rockets, we had a guy who was a former military expert with explosives, assassinations. He'd been in Vietnam. He knew what he was doing. He was building these rockets, and one accidentally went off in his hand, scarred his hands pretty bad. So we looked at that as a sign from God that this is not what we're supposed to do. We interpreted everything as a sign of God on what to do and what not to do. So once that happened, we decided we need to do something different, because something more personal concerning the call case and our friends that had gotten arrested. So we made an attempt to, or plans to assassinate the federal judge in the case, federal prosecutor, and the main FBI agent. We made plans to go there to their homes on December 26th of 1983 and ring the doorbell, assassinate them, and leave. We knew this would cause quite a ripple effect throughout the country. So we left early on that morning. It had snowed, which was not predicted. So the conditions on the roads were not the best. And on the way there, we were probably about halfway there on a 4-hour trip. We were going around the curve. Another couple was coming around the curve from the opposite direction. They were sliding in our lane, and we ended up running into each other head on, and that disabled our vehicle. We had 2 vehicles, but the one that disabled was the one that had all the weapons and stuff in it. So we had to rush to get the weapons out of that one and to the other car, while I took care of making sure the elderly couple were okay. And we ended up having to wait for the cops to show up about the accident. In the meantime, the other people had left of our group. It was me and one other guy stayed, and everything was taken care of. And because we saw that again as a sign from God, this is not what we were supposed to do, we turned around and went back to our compound. So that looked, honestly, for me and for Jim, a little bit of a relief and promising that maybe what we were considering before, going back to our spiritual roots, is what we were supposed to do. Unfortunately, Jim and I were having a wedge between us, a lot of rift between us over the polygamy issue, and we were getting at odds, and it was getting pretty severe. So in June of 1984, I was just exhausted and tired. I wanted to leave. My wife didn't, so we stayed. But I went to Jim and I said, okay, if you want this to start, if you want to start what we call the Second American Revolution in the race rights, have our munitions guy get me a silenced weapon and make me a bomb, and I'll go to Kansas City and we'll start this thing. Kansas City was picked out because we, the weekend before, had seen a news report of a park that had turned into a gay park, it said. And that every Saturday night, gays would circle or go to the park and pick up other gays. This was obviously one of the things that we were against and saw as signs of the end times, the last days. So I was going to go around and circle the park on a Saturday night, shoot whoever was there, and then take the bomb to an adult bookstore and blow it up as a sign. These are the two things that we're standing against, homosexuality and pornography. And then that would be a sign to the other groups that it was time to rise up. So I took a man with the group who was raised in Kansas City, so he knew his way around, I didn't. Took him. We went to the gay park, got there about 11 o'clock to 12 o'clock at night, and circled it, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 times. Nothing, nobody. Kind of threw us, honestly, because we were just expecting a lot of people to be there. So we left that, figured out, drove around till we found an adult bookstore. He was going to stay in the car. I was going to take the briefcase in, go to the back, set the timer, leave, and it would blow up. Walked into the door. The clerk saw me, said, "Come on in, but you can't take your briefcase in." I realized instantly that, of course, I can't take a briefcase in. They'd think I was going to steal magazines or movies or whatever. So I said, "No, never mind. I'll just take this back out to the car, and then I'll be right back in." Went back out to the car. We couldn't figure out what to do, so I said, "Okay, let's stay the night, and then we'll figure out if God wants to, if He shows us something to do tomorrow." So that's next morning, of course, was Sunday. And my friend said, "Well, let me take you to the church I was raised up in, and we'll go over there until we figure out what the Lord wants." Okay. So we drove there, and as soon as we drove up, I said, "Are you sure this is your church?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "It's not your church anymore. It's the Metropolitan Community Church." So the sign out front, which was, of course, in those days, the #1 gay church in America. Mm-hmm. So we both kind of looked at each other and said, "Well, maybe this is what the Lord wants us to do." So we decided to go in, took the briefcase in, and all I had to do was, lift the top of the briefcase just enough to flip the switch. There was a timer. It would go off a few minutes later, and they'd give us time to get away. But I told my friend, we can't just go in there and set the timer and walk out immediately. People might be suspicious, so we'd have to stick around for half hour. I never had gone into a gay church, obviously, before. And it was interesting because the ladies were on one side, the men were on the other side. And there's a little bit of affection, but not really what we had been sort of told to expect. We had this stereotype that there would be this wild sexual orgy going on, which there, of course, there wasn't.
Devil's horns and everything.
Yeah, devil's horns, the pitchforks, the tails, the whole, third eye, the forehead. I mean, who knows what we were going to find out there. So
it wasn't like that.
It wasn't like that. So, we sat down. The pastor got up, started talking about his sexual relations with the music director. Of course, he had no gay marriages in those days. So, again, this looked like something that was obviously against what we were standing for. And they did the typical church thing of announcements and, the passing the plate, all that kind of stuff. So while that was going on, I did what you're not supposed to do, and that's to put a face on the enemy, because I couldn't help it. I'm right there with the enemy. So I'm looking around and realizing, first of all, these people look no different than I do. They don't look like they. If you saw them on the street, there's not a big H on their forehead that says homosexual. There's no indication that they were any different than me. Second thing I did was to think, what's really going to happen? First of all, these people have never done anything to me. They've never hurt my family or any friends I've got. So what's really going to happen if I do this besides killing 60, 70 people? Is this really going to start the Second American Revolution? Are people really going to rise up and have a race war? Or is probably what's going to happen is I'm going to spend the rest of my life in prison or on death row or have a shootout with cops somewhere down the road, neither of which were very appealing to me whatsoever. So that started me kind of thinking, again, something you're just not supposed to do. And then the slap in the face of reality for me was the music started. And music was an integral part of our church, as it is with every church, really. And I heard the music starting, and all of a sudden I'm looking around, and people are doing exactly what we did at our church services, closing their eyes, looking up, lifting their hands, lifting their heads, and just praising God. And it hit me that these people, these outcasts of society, are only trying to find their place in God, like I'm trying to find my place in God. They're wanting to fit in, and it's a struggle for them. I was wanting to fit in, and life at the farm had become a struggle for me. So I related to these people right off the bat as soon as they started doing that. And all of a sudden, they ceased to be homosexuals. They became Christians, and I couldn't kill Christians. So I told the guy next to me, we got to go. I picked up the briefcase, and we left. We got out to the car. He wanted to know what was going on. I told him, and he said, "I'm so glad, because I did not think we were supposed to do this either." So it was a confirmation for both of us. We left, drove about 4 hours back to our compound, where I had to tell Ellison what happened.
Yeah. But at this point, after what happened, you wanted to leave, but you just felt that you couldn't at that point. Isn't that right?
Yes. Once that was over, we went, like I said, we went to the farm, got to Ellison's house. All the men at Ellison are looking at the news, waiting to hear something. We walked in. Jim wanted to know what happened. I told him. So he looked at me and he said, "You're just a traitor. You're a coward. You betrayed us. You didn't do the mission." Said in front of the men. And of course, I felt humiliated, ashamed. Saw no sense of why he would do that. So I said to myself, I wanted to leave. Left his house, went back down to my house, and on the way I just was saying, "Lord, I'm leaving. It's time for me to leave. I just want to leave." And I heard the Lord speak to me, and He said, "No, you cannot leave." And what? I said, "I'm tired. I'm out of here." "No, you got to stay." And I prayed about it at least a half dozen times after that. Every time it was just a flat no, you can't leave, with no explanation. So I said, okay, if I got to stay, I'm going to do my best to turn this thing around like it used to be. Problem was, nobody knew what it used to be except me and Jim. Everybody else had been there a lot less time. Wasn't there in the beginning when it was just the spiritual roots. So nobody knew kind of what to go back to except me. So I was trying to make everything as normal as possible. Jim and I kept having arguments over it. I kept resisting him. By this point in the fall of '84, members of the order are getting arrested. So there was news reports about it. There was discussions on the news about members turning state's evidence. So I knew it was inevitable. Former members of CSA were going to turn state's evidence against us. That was just going to happen.
Well, everything came to a head in 1985 when your group found itself on one side of a standoff with the FBI. So how did that all come to be?
Like I said, I knew things were going to change because of what's going on with the arrest of the order. So in 1985, in February, I approached an Arkansas State police officer, unknown to anybody at the farm, unknown to my wife even. This was a man who had tried to befriend me the summer before. So I went to him. I felt like I could trust him to some degree. And I said, if there's an arrest warrant comes down on Jim, please come and talk to me first. Don't just let the feds come in and enforce, because if they do, if they try to raid the place, we're going to shoot it out, and you'll have a bloodbath you can't even begin to imagine, because we have a lot of weapons. We've been trained. We know what we're doing. And as much as we don't want problems, we're not going to abide coming in and force. And he said, as far as I know, there's not an arrest warrant on Jim right now. And if there is, I will come and talk to you. So that was in February. April, the arrest warrant came down for Jim on conspiracy to possess unregistered weapons. And this officer came down and talked to me first by himself. Said, yes, it's come down. can you get Jim to come with me and I'll take him to town? So I went and talked to Jim. Jim said, no, I'm not going. I want to pray about it tonight, see what the Lord wants me to do. So I went back and told Gene he's not coming. He wants to pray about it tonight. He said, do you understand what we're talking about here? And I said, yeah, Gene, I get the point. He said, but I said, I can't force him to come out, and you can't come in. I said, give him tonight, and we'll see what's going on. Well, this is on April 18th. So he said, by noon tomorrow, the feds will be here and will encircle the place. So got up early. Actually that afternoon, we went and got some supplies in town, some of us, and nobody was allowed back in except for me. And they weren't going to let me back in. I said, if you don't let me back in, there will never be a peaceful resolution to this. Jim, we'll shoot it out with you. So they talked it over. They decided to let me come back in. The next morning, we had already been, which was April 19th, we got surrounded by 300 law enforcement officers from all the way from local, all the way up to the FBI's hostage rescue team, ATF, DEA, National Guard. It seems like, Water Patrol, everybody was there.
Wow.
So we had a standoff. Jim sent me out. I did not go out with military camouflage as we normally dress. I went out with civilian clothes. Started going out, saw a sniper in the woods, so I approached him. He said, told me to stop. Got on his headphones and asked me if I was willing to go down to the area known as the Valley, which was my settlement, and to talk to the man in charge. I said, sure. So I went down about a quarter mile down. And of course I could see on the way down there, guns rained on me. And I knew if I made one small wrong move, I'm going to get killed on this thing. Yeah. So it's different. When you talk about stuff, it's different when you're walking down there by yourself and guns are on you. And one wrong move and you're dead. So I walked very slowly down there, had my arms out, made sure I didn't make any false moves whatsoever or quick moves. Got down there, met a man named Danny Colson, who was in charge of the operation. Danny was, shorter than I am, small guy, but he had a presence about him. He had this character about him. Liked him as soon as I saw him. He reminded me of Jim the first time I saw him. So Danny and I started talking, and he said, look, I want to make this clear to you. I am not, and none of us are going to shoot first. We're not here to kill anybody. We're not here to destroy your place. But if you fire first, I've got a Huey helicopter over the hill with a 50 caliber machine gun. I've got a 50 caliber machine gun on the hill. We will start shooting holes in your buildings. Your buildings would be torn down in no time at all. We've got a tank on the other side of the hill, and it's going to come in and roll over your buildings also. And within 30 seconds, every man, woman, and child on your property will be killed. Is that what you want? I said, no, sir. It's not what I want. I said, but you sound pretty serious. He said, I want you to understand this and take this as a compliment. They only send us against the best that there is. And you're considered the best for a civilian SWAT team. So we're not taking this lightly either. So don't take it lightly yourselves. It's okay. He said, so what do we need to do to resolve this? I said, I've got to go back and talk to Jim, and I'll probably be back several times. He said, we need to get this resolved today if possible. I said, okay. So I went back, talked to Jim. Of course, he was not going to surrender. He was making plans on either going to war, trying to escape, waiting for God to open up the earth and swallow the feds, whatever he could conjure up in his mind that was going to happen. So he wanted me to keep going back and stalling. That was his understanding of what I was doing. My understanding of what I was doing was coming to a peaceful resolution so nobody would get killed. I wanted Jim to surrender, get this nightmare over with, because that's what it had become. So I kept going back and forth, Danny and I kept talking. Second day, which was April 19th, we were harboring some fugitives from the order some of which were neo-Nazi, and April 20th is Hitler's birthday. So they wanted to shoot it out on Hitler's birthday. So it was extremely tense at the farm. I'm down there with Danny talking to him, and we hear a shot go off. Immediately he gets on the radio and finds out it was a local who actually misfired his weapon. And I had to go up real quick and tell the guys it was one of them actually shooting, but they were not shooting at us. So fortunately it didn't escalate at that point. Went back down, kept talking to Danny. And when I'm at the farm, I'm going around to some of my best friends and just crying, saying, I'm trying my best to end this peace, but I don't think I'm going to be successful. I think by the end of tonight, we're all going to be dead. I just can't contain this thing good enough. I'm just exhausted. So I go back down and talk to Danny. Fortunately, we went another night and nothing happened. Went the third day, nothing happened. Fourth day, myself and Ellison's wife, Ollie, had been talking to him, going over the last several years of things that we had planned to do that God seemed to intervene with and tell us not to do. You know, the directions of God and the steps of God on this whole thing. We just kept going over everything, saying, we don't believe we're supposed to shoot it out. You need to surrender so no one's hurt. Eventually, on the fourth day, he worked it out in his mind where he could justify in his mind to go ahead and surrender with the ability of saying that now I believe that God wants me to surrender. So that's really what it got down to, making him get to that point. So I went down, told Danny, Jim's going to surrender. So he had me go up and get the women, the children, or get the men together, because he did not want the women and children coming down first, because if it left only the men might change their minds and shoot it out, go down as martyrs. So I went up, told Jim, we got to go. All the other men are dressed in their camouflage. He formed a two-line marching down the hill with him in the center front. I was in the center back. The men were singing one of our, what we call war songs on the way down. Everybody's singing the war songs with me, and all I'm doing is crying because the nightmares seem to be over. Nobody died, and everything that I've been going through for the last couple of years is over with. So we got down there. Ellison is approached by Danny. Danny Colson looks at him and says, look, I'm not going to handcuff you in front of your men because I would not want to be handcuffed in front of mine. Was not expecting that. So he did that, and did that when he shouldn't have done that. I need to back up just for a second. One of the things that Danny did on the third day, Jim wanted to go down and meet Danny, kind of scope him out, see, feel him out what he felt like. So I went down and told Danny, Jim wants to come down and talk to you, then go right back up to the front. He said, I can't do that. I got an arrest warrant. If he comes to my area, I've got to grab him and arrest him. I said, look, Danny, but what's the worst that's going to happen? He's just going to go back where he is right now. You're not losing anything, and it will help Jim to figure out what he needs to do. He said, okay, go ahead and do it. So I brought Jim down. Of course, they frisked him. He talked to Jim, and Danny talked for a while. Jim said, I want to go back and have my wife come down and talk to you. His first wife, Ollie. So Danny said, okay. So we went up there to get Ollie, and for me to get Ollie, and Jim was going to stay there. Now, Danny had it in his mind that Ollie was going to be this, in his sort of thinking, a stereotypical cult leader's wife that was beaten down, very mild-mannered kind of thing. Sort of like a church mouse. It was the old phrase. And she came down. Now, Ollie is anything but what he expected. She is a regal, royal air about her. She's very articulate, very well-spoken, knowledgeable. She came down, head held up high, standing straight up, And Danny was very, very affected by her. Was pretty impressed with her because she was not what he expected. So they talked for a little bit. Ollie felt good about him, went back up and started talking to Jim about surrender. So that impressed Jim and I both, and Ollie as well, that Danny Colson kept his word. He did things that he was not supposed to do, things that they had never done in the past. Danny formed the HRT, the Hostage Rescue Team of the FBI. He created it. And in every other time they'd been used, he was the tactical leader. This was the first time he had been the hostage negotiator as well. Usually there's two different people doing those two roles, Danny and somebody else. But the FBI profiler told Danny, you need to negotiate this because Ellison will never surrender to somebody he does not consider an equal to. And he considers himself the general of this army. So he's got to be able to see you as that way also. And they were correct. He would not have surrendered. The man that they originally were going to have as a negotiator, I'd have never negotiated with him. He had a bad reputation. It would have ended everything, and we would have probably shut it out. But not with Danny Colson. He did everything he was supposed to do. He went outside the rules and kept his word. And that was very impressive, very important for us. So by that point, the federal prosecutor of the case had come down. We had made a surrender agreement, conditions that we wanted if we were going to surrender. Of all the points, we got all of them, but about 4 or 5 of them the government would just not abide by. But it was enough that we said, okay. So the man came down, like I said, we surrendered. They took Jim off, and then when they got past visual sight, they handcuffed him. Then I went back and got the women and the children who were all taken to town. The next day, I was allowed to be there because that was part of the agreement, while the ATF and FBI and DEA and everybody else searched the property for evidence. It sounds funny today. I wanted to be there because we wanted to make sure the DEA, who we knew was there, wouldn't plant any kind of drug evidence on us, because there was already enough evidence to arrest everybody, but we didn't want to be known as having drugs there also. So it was important for me to be there.
But the bombs and things, that was okay.
That was okay with them, and it was okay with me. It was and here's the funny part. I mean, you got to remember, we're pretty good economy, pretty big. We had a lot of families there, a lot of animals, and we had a scrap metal business there, which just irritated the crap out of me, but we did, and it was just bad looking. All the agents came in and searched the property, and you see in all the TV shows and the movies, they just tear everything apart, and they didn't do that. And I used to joke that they made the place better looking after they left than it was before they got there. They fed our animals, they cleaned up after themselves, they were careful not to tear anything apart that didn't have to be torn apart, based upon the evidence that they had gotten from former members of where stuff was hidden.
Yeah. So
they went, I thought, beyond the call of duty also. And that was very impressive for me to watch and witness. So, it ended on a good note, actually.
Kerry, you've had a lot of time to reflect on those days, and you've even written 2 books on the subject. Now, what many people are probably asking themselves is, what makes a person join a group like CSA?
We were a little different in the sense that we evolved. We didn't start out as a racist, violent organization. I've always said if CSA was, or if the farm was like it was in 1980s when I went there in the 70s, it was not what I would have gotten into myself. It evolved. In the book, I talk about the old thing of a frog in hot water. You throw the frog in hot water, he jumps out. Put him in cold water and start slowly boiling it, and he'll boil to death. And that's kind of what happened with us. So for us, everything was built upon the premise of end time eschatology, that Jesus was going to come back and there was going to be this world domination of one government, one world religion. For religious groups, which there's not that many of, but going to the extent that we did, we were more the exception than the rule. Most people get involved in the movement for one reason and one reason only. Well, two. One, if they're raised in it. If they're a second, third, fourth, fifth generation races, they're going to probably get involved with it also. But that's more the exceptions also. Generally, when people get involved who don't have any kind of background in their family, it's simply because there's something in their life that they're not happy with. They're at a point to where things are just going wrong, and they want somebody to blame because they feel out of control, that life is out of control, and they don't understand why it's happening to them. So somebody comes along and says, well, I can tell you who to blame. It's the Jews, it's the blacks, it's the foreigners who are coming over, taking your jobs, whatever it is. You find their hot button, and then you'll know where to guide them and direct them on who to blame. Once they catch that, then you can manipulate them even further with more propaganda, some material to read, things like that, take them to the meetings, and start to indoctrinate them. But it's always because people are not happy with their lives. That opens them up to being able to be seduced into extremism.
But you were very happy with your life when you had moved to Arkansas.
Yes, I was extremely happy. I'd had a good life. My wife and I were expecting our second child, as I said before. I was going to Bible college. If I had gone up there and seen guns, heard a bunch of racist stuff, I'd have packed it up as fast as I could and moved back to Dallas. For us, it took a process. From 77 to 81, in sort of 1 year leaps from step to step. Seems quick, but when you're living that 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, because we're all living on the same property, it doesn't seem as fast as what it does when you're on the outside. So the evolution of our group took time from our point of view, even though from the outside it seemed like it went fast. But it was enough of the turning up the flame to get the water boiling. And we just got caught up in the deception.
And I suppose those two cassette tapes, they accelerated things at certain points.
The cassette tapes sped things along. It's the old thing of meeting the wrong people at the wrong time kind of deal. We did that. If I had never gotten the John Todd tape, or if I had listened to it and said, no, this is not for us, and thrown it away, things would have been different. If Jim had never gone to Missouri to work and met Dan Gaiman, things would have been different. Little things. If we'd have just rejected, the racist part and, done our due diligence, things would have been different. But in those days, of course, we didn't have the internet. We didn't have any way of really trying to see what the other side said. So, the only material we were getting was from other right-wing groups. We weren't watching TV news anymore. We quit reading magazines, newspapers, that kind of stuff. So
it's no different than the internet now. Somebody might see something on Facebook and get radicalized, but you had these cassette tapes and I suppose various speakers who you went to see.
Right. Now with the internet, and especially with a year of COVID where people are not going out, or maybe some have lost their jobs, staying home, all they're going to do is sit at the internet. And once you find one site that has conspiracy stuff on it, it's going to take you from site to site to site. And all you've got all day long is to sit there and get programmed. So the COVID thing for our country came at a horrible time with Trump in office, already spouting off stuff about false voting results when the voting does get here, really not doing anything about the epidemic going on in the country, already making accusations about people, inciting violence. I mean, it was just not a good time. So it gave people a lot more time. Again, 1 year doesn't seem like that much, but if all you're doing is sitting in front of the internet and getting propaganda, that's effective.
Well, groups like the CSA still persist in the world. Militant, right-wing conspiratorial groups like QAnon are all over the news. So, Kerry, what would you say to anyone who is sympathetic to such organizations? And also, what would you say to someone who is currently part of a hateful group, but perhaps is having doubts?
If you're having doubts, if you're involved in a hate group right now, or an extremist group of any kind right now, and you're having any kind of doubts, get out. If it seems like you can't get out, here's what you need to do. One, if you're having doubts, step back a little bit. Start examining everything that's going on as if you're, hundreds of miles away, looking down on the scene. Look at your leadership. Can you trust your leadership? Can you trust every word they say? If not, get out. Is your leadership willing to sacrifice himself, or is he just sending other people in as the sacrificial lambs, as I call them? If he's not getting his hands dirty, get out, because he just wants to manipulate people into doing all the bad stuff. Look at really what's going on. In this country, we had the Capitol riots. And I know people got stirred up. I know some of them didn't mean anything by it. Some meant more about it than others. But as you saw, it went down for nothing. Everything that happened was for nothing. And now people will go to jail. And if you continue down the road of extremism, one of two things will happen to you. You will either go to jail or you will die in a shootout. There's no other choices, because you can't stay in the movement forever and not continually get more and more aggressive and more extremist. At some point, you're going to cross the line. And once you cross the line, there's no turning back. So get out while you can. Try to find support with other organizations, with some formers who have gotten out. There's organizations like Life After Hate. There's an organization called Against Violent Extremism. There's several formers now that weren't around when I got out. There was nobody when I got out. So get a hold of somebody. Call the Southern Poverty Law Center, Anti-Defamation League. Call somebody and get some help, because there is hope after hate.
Well, it's quite an experience you've had, Kerry. I want to thank you for coming on to the show to go into such detail and to share your thoughts on it all. Now, if anyone wants to go into even more depth, they can find both your books on Amazon, and I believe the second edition is out of Tabernacle of Hate, and that's the one to look for. So I will leave links to those books as well as your social media in the description below. And all that's left to say is thank you once again, Kerry, for coming on to Talk Beliefs.
Thanks, Mark. I appreciate it. I appreciate the opportunity to help people to get out of this hate thing, and appreciate you having me on here.